Tyler's Harvard mug exploded against the kitchen tile, coffee splashing across the floor as his face went ghost white at the barrage of emails lighting up his phone. And what my family discovered just seconds later was something they never imagined their perfect son could be hiding. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you would do in a moment like this. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. Christmas morning sunlight streamed through the window, but the room felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if the truth itself had lowered the temperature. My mother hovered beside Tyler, her hand trembling inches from his shoulder. She kept whispering, "It's a mistake. It has to be," though even she didn't sound convinced. My father stood frozen, scrolling through the emails with a growing horror he couldn't hide. But to understand the collapse unfolding in front of them, you have to go back 24 hours, to the moment my parents still believed their golden child could do no wrong. We were standing in the hallway where every framed achievement belonged to Tyler, his trophies, his awards, his degrees. The entire space was a shrine to his success, and it was under those carefully polished reminders that my parents delivered a decision that told me exactly where I stood in this family. Apologize to your brother for accusing him of academic theft, or lose your tuition, your housing, your future. My mother's voice cracked with performative heartbreak. My father looked at me with the disappointment of a man whose reputation mattered more than evidence. And Tyler, leaning casually against the wall, wore that signature smirk that had followed him since childhood. The smirk that always meant, "They're on my side. You never stood a chance." He expected me to crumble, to swallow the truth, to apologize for daring to disrupt the narrative they'd built around him for 25 years. But instead, something inside me aligned. Calmly, quietly, decisively. "All right," I said. 2 words. Soft. Controlled. They heard surrender. But the truth was already moving, unstoppable, undeniable, and closer than any of them realized. So when Tyler's phone lit up the next morning, and his perfect world started cracking in real time, my parents looked at him like the universe had betrayed them. But I didn't flinch, because I knew exactly what those emails contained, and I knew Christmas morning was only the beginning. The strange thing about truth is how quietly it sits in the background before it chooses its moment to roar. The night before everything fell apart, I found myself standing in my childhood bedroom, the walls still painted the soft blue I picked when I was 10. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like a room I'd been borrowing my entire life. I could hear Tyler downstairs, laughing with my parents as if nothing in the world could ever touch him. That laugh, smooth, effortless, rehearsed from years of being adored, echoed up the staircase and curled under my skin. I remember staring at my reflection in the window, the soft glow of Christmas lights flickering outside, and thinking, how did we get here? How did my life get small enough to fit inside their version of me? That was the light part. The calm before the pressure shifted. Because when my parents called me into the living room, the mood changed. Not suddenly, more like a slow tightening, the way a storm pulls the sky darker inch by inch. My mother sat with her hands clasped too neatly, the way she did when she was preparing for a speech. My father paced once, twice, then stopped in front of me with the heavy authority of someone who had already decided the ending. "Christine," he began, "this accusation you've made against your brother, it's not just hurtful. It's destructive." My mother nodded, adding softly, "We raised you better than to tear down family." Tyler didn't have to speak. He just sat there, one ankle resting casually over his knee, that familiar half smile, the one that said, "I'm untouchable," taking up more space than his actual body. The tension grew, not loud, but steady, a tightening rope. I explained the timestamps, the drafts, the stolen paragraphs, but every sentence I spoke seemed to evaporate halfway to their ears. My father's jaw clenched. "Your brother is a Harvard graduate," my mother added, "and you've struggled." Maybe you misread things." There it was, the first real fracture, not in their belief, in mine. Because for the first time, I saw it clearly. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the story they had invested their entire identities in. The escalation sharpened. Tyler leaned forward, placing a hand on my mother's knee like he was soothing her. "She's overwhelmed," he said gently. "She's been under so much pressure with school. I've been worried about her for months." It was a masterclass in manipulation, performed in real time with my parents hanging on to every word. And then came the ultimatum. Cold, precise, delivered like a verdict. "Apologize," my father said, "or we cut financial support. All of it." My heart didn't drop. It hardened. Like something inside me clicked into alignment. I looked at them, these people who raised me, yet somehow never saw me, and I realized I was done auditioning for a role they'd already cast Tyler in. "All right," I said. 2 small words. Not surrender. A spark. Because conflict doesn't explode all at once. It builds. Pressure, heat, truth compacted into something volatile. And the next morning, when Tyler's phone lit up and his entire world began to collapse, that quiet spark I carried inside me finally had room to breathe. Everything was about to break open. What happened next didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like a slow-motion landslide. The kind you hear before you see, the kind you can't outrun even when you know what's coming. Christmas Eve in our house used to mean pies cooling on the counter, my mother humming along to old jazz records, my father pouring wine like he was hosting a diplomatic dinner. But that night, the air felt so tight it could snap. I stayed in my room as long as I could, listening to the muffled rise and fall of my family's laughter from downstairs. Tyler's voice carried the loudest, smooth, polished, just a little too bright, like a man performing joy rather than feeling it. Every now and then I'd hear my mother say something like, "Our Tyler," in that tender, possessive tone she never used for me, and I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling like a ghost in my own home. But ghosts don't open doors. People do, and I refused to be invisible for one more night. When I finally stepped into the dining room, the conversation dipped, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Tyler glanced up, flashed me a warm smile so convincing even I felt momentarily disoriented. That was his talent. He could perform sincerity better than most people felt it. "Christine!" he said brightly, lifting his wine. "We were just talking about my upcoming publication." Of course they were. My aunts and uncles turned toward me with polite smiles, unaware of the storm brewing under the surface. The table was beautiful, candles, greenery, expensive dishes my mother only used for special holidays. It should have felt festive. Instead, it felt like a stage built for a play I never agreed to be part of. My father nodded toward me. "Your brother's research is going to change the field, Christine. Did you hear? His fellowship director said it's groundbreaking." Groundbreaking. A word I had used 100 times in my own thesis drafts. There are moments in life when pain doesn't feel like a stab. It feels like a slow pour, warm and relentless, filling every empty space inside you. That's what hearing my own work praised under Tyler's name felt like. My mother reached for the mashed potatoes, smiling at me as if we were all living the same happy script. "You should be proud of him," she said gently. And that was it. That was when something inside me, something small, fragile, tired, finally snapped. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than my heartbeat, "I'd like to share something about Tyler's research." The room stilled. Not quiet. Still. The way a forest holds its breath when it senses a predator. I set the folders on the table. Every page, every timestamp, every comparison, months of documentation, neatly organized, highlighted, undeniable. "His work is identical to mine," I said, "word for word, data for data. He didn't discover anything. He stole it." For a split second, No one moved. Then the reactions came all at once. Confusion, discomfort, disbelief. My mother was the first to break. "Christine," she whispered, her voice laced with deep embarrassment. "This isn't the time." Tyler let out a soft, wounded laugh. A masterful performance. "Oh, Christine, not this again." He reached for one of the packets, flipping through it like a disappointed parent reviewing a child's spelling test. "These are misunderstandings. She's been overwhelmed, stressed. I've been telling you for months." And there it was. The shift, the pivot, the weaponization of concern. My father leaned forward, trying to gather the room back into the narrative he preferred. "We're not doing this. Tyler has earned every achievement. You're confused." Confused. The insult didn't land as hard as it used to. I had grown past needing their belief. I forced myself to breathe, to stay grounded in the truth I had carried alone for too long. "This is my work," I repeated, and he published it before I submitted it. Tyler placed a hand on my mother's shoulder, gentle, protective, rehearsed. "Christine, please, let's talk privately later." That was the moment I realized he wasn't afraid of the accusation. He wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of losing control of the room, and so he reached for the oldest, sharpest blade in his arsenal. "She's been struggling," he told them softly. "Academically, emotionally, I think she's having a hard time." Aunt Marlene gasped. My cousin shifted uncomfortably. My grandfather, the engineer, picked up the packet and examined it with narrowed eyes. My father stood, a gesture that meant finality, authority. "Apologize to your brother. Tonight." I looked at all of them, feeling something deep inside me rise. Not anger, not bitterness, something cleaner. "No," I said. My father's face hardened. "Then we stop paying your tuition." Tyler looked at me like he'd won, like the universe had finally put me back in my place. But he didn't know what I knew. He didn't know what I had prepared. He didn't know that by morning, every institution he'd ever impressed would read the truth for themselves. "All right," I whispered. "Not surrender." A match dropped in dry grass. Christmas morning would burn, and none of them saw the flames yet. Christmas morning should have smelled like cinnamon and pine needles. Instead, it smelled like fear, not mine, theirs. When I walked downstairs, the house felt suspended between two realities, the one my parents still clung to, and the one that had already begun swallowing Tyler whole. My father stood at the kitchen counter gripping his phone like a lifeline, my mother pacing tightly, her robe swishing around her ankles. But Tyler looked like someone had cracked open his rib cage and replaced his heartbeat with panic. His phone was vibrating non-stop. Harvard, Mass General Hospital, the medical board, fellowship coordinators, one after another in a relentless cascade. And then came the moment everything snapped. He opened the first email. His breath caught, his face drained, his knees almost buckled. No, this has to be a mistake," he whispered, voice shrill with disbelief. But it wasn't one mistake. It was 7 years' worth of choices finally catching up. When he opened the second email, his hands shook so violently that he dropped the phone. It hit the tile with a dull, heavy sound, a sound that felt too symbolic to ignore. My father lunged forward. "What's happening, son? What's going on?" Tyler's voice cracked. They're opening an investigation. Harvard wants a formal statement. They think I plagiarized. They said..." His throat closed. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what they said. My mother pressed a hand to her chest. "Tyler, sweetheart, tell them the truth. Tell them Christine made this up." Her desperation wasn't anger, it was denial. A mother fighting the death of the narrative she'd built her entire life around. She looked at me the way someone looks at a fire they thought they'd extinguished years ago. "How could you do this?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because just then, another email chimed, then another, then another. Tyler grabbed the phone again, his breaths coming fast and thin. "Oh my God," he choked. "Mass General wants me in Boston. Today. They're suspending me until the investigation ends." Suspending. The golden verb no golden child ever expected to hear? My father's voice dropped to a harsh rasp. "Suspending you for what?" Tyler turned slowly, his eyes hitting mine like thrown knives. "Because of her," he bit out. "She sent them everything." That was when my parents turned toward me, slowly, mechanically, like they were afraid of what they might see. But before they could speak, another chime sliced through the room. This email was worse. I could tell from the way Tyler's shoulders folded inward. "No?" he whispered. No, this can't be happening. They're reviewing every patient I treated under my research protocol. They said there's potential risk." My father froze. My mother gasped, and Tyler looked like his world had just been ripped from the hinges. "Someone could have been hurt because of your mistake?" my father stammered. "It wasn't a mistake," Tyler exploded. "I didn't do anything wrong. He stopped. "This is Christine's fault." My father spun toward me. "Look at what you've done to your brother." The old me would have shrunk. The old me would have apologized just to keep the peace, but I had walked through fire to get here, so instead I spoke quietly, steady, undeniable. "I didn't ruin anything," I said. "He built his career on stolen work. All I did was stop pretending it wasn't happening." Tyler's voice cracked into a scream. "You're lying. You've always been jealous." I stared at him, really stared. And for the first time, I didn't see brilliance. I didn't see the flawless sun. I saw a man drowning in the consequences of his own choices. My mother reached for me, her voice trembling. "Christine, please, take it back. Tell them it's not true. Tell them you were confused." "Confused?" I repeated, my voice soft but sharp enough to slice through the room. "I have timestamps, drafts, login records, and 7 years of stolen research." The room fell silent. The truth hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. And then, Tyler broke, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in small, devastating increments. He sagged against the counter, clutching his forehead, the phone slipping from his fingers again. My career, my life, everything gone. Because of you. "No," I corrected gently. "Because of you." My father inhaled sharply, as if the air had betrayed him. He turned the nearest evidence packet over with trembling fingers, scanning the highlighted comparisons. His eyes darted back and forth, confusion cracking into realization, realization cracking into horror. "Tyler," he whispered, "these paragraphs, they're identical." My mother shook her head violently. No, this is taken out of context. She must have manipulated something." But my grandfather's voice, steadier, older, wiser, cut through the denial like a blade. "She didn't manipulate anything," he said from the doorway, holding a packet of evidence he'd reviewed before coming over. "I've checked the sources, this is real." The room fell so silent it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Tyler looked up at me with a kind of broken fury. You destroyed everything." "No," I said again, calm as snowfall. "I stopped the destruction from spreading." And that was when I saw it. The shift in the air, the fracture in the family dynamic, the moment the truth finally forced its way into the light. Their golden boy wasn't shining anymore. He was burning. And they couldn't look away. The moment my grandfather spoke, something inside the room shifted, subtle, but undeniable. It was like watching a tall glass tower catch its first crack. You don't see the fall yet, but you feel it coming. My father, still clutching the evidence packet, looked as if gravity itself had turned against him. My mother's breathing grew fast and shallow, as though the truth were a physical weight pressing down on her chest. But Tyler looked like a man watching his reflection shatter, piece by piece with no way to glue it back together. "Dad," he pleaded, voice jagged. "You can't believe this. You know me. You know I wouldn't." But my father didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He kept staring at the evidence as if the pages might suddenly rearrange themselves into a lie he preferred. My mother finally broke the silence, her voice desperate and trembling. "Honey, please. There must be an explanation. Someone framed you, or Christine misunderstood." "I didn't misunderstand anything," I said softly. "It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity. You stole from me, from your classmates, from published researchers, and now patients are at risk because you used work you didn't even understand." The truth landed like a blow. Tyler's expression twisted. Rage, humiliation, fear, all cramped together in a single, collapsing mask. He stepped toward me, but my father instinctively moved between us, a gesture so unexpected that even Tyler stopped in his tracks. My father's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerous. "Tyler, tell me right now, did you take your sister's work?" That was the moment, the unraveling. The first time in 25 years my father didn't automatically stand in Tyler's shadow, but in my way. Tyler's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out, only a strangled noise that sounded too close to the truth to be deniable. My mother shook her head violently. "Stop this, all of you. This family is tearing itself apart." Her voice cracked, because Christine couldn't just drop it. That was when something in me snapped, not out of anger, but out of realization. Drop it. That was all they ever wanted, not truth, not fairness, just silence. I met her eyes. I didn't tear this family apart. I just refused to keep pretending. Another chime echoed through the room, another email. Tyler flinched like he'd been hit. He picked up his phone with shaking hands and read silently, lips parted, breath stuttering. Then he whispered, "Harvard's recommending degree revocation, immediate revocation." His knees buckled and he sank into a chair, eyes hollow. My father closed his own eyes, exhaling the kind of breath a man only releases when he knows he's lost control of everything he thought he owned, including the truth. My mother covered her mouth and turned away, as if looking at her son was suddenly too painful. And for the first time in my life, I saw the truth they had avoided for decades. Tyler wasn't the golden boy. He was the golden mistake they never questioned. The room felt smaller, thicker, like everyone was running out of air. Finally, my father turned to me, eyes raw, voice unsteady. "Christine? What happens next?" There it was, the reversal, the unspoken admission. For the first time, they weren't asking what Tyler wanted. They were asking me. In the months that followed, life didn't fall neatly into place. Nothing ever does after an earthquake. But something inside me shifted in a way I can still feel when I wake up in the middle of the night, and the world is quiet enough to hear my own thoughts. For the first time, I wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's story. I was writing my own. Tyler faced his consequences. Every investigation, every hearing, every piece of the truth he thought he could outrun. My parents went through their own reckoning, the kind that strips away pride and forces you to look honestly at the way you loved, the way you failed, the way you chose comfort over truth. And as painful as it was for them, something softer began to grow in that space. Understanding, humility, a kind of love that didn't need illusions to survive. As for me, I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like losing things you never thought you'd survive without. But somewhere along the way, you realize you didn't lose yourself. You found yourself. And that changes everything. The truth is this: family isn't defined by who protects the lie. It's defined by who can stand with you in the truth. If there's one lesson I carry from all of this, it's that silence is not kindness, and endurance is not love. The moment you start shrinking to make someone else shine, you begin disappearing from your own life. And eventually, you must choose: keep shrinking, or finally stand tall, even if your legs shake while you do it. And here's the line that stayed with me long after everything settled. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear. If this story touched you in any way, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps these stories find the people who need them most. And if you've ever had to choose truth over acceptance, I hope you know, truly know, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And wherever you are, I hope you keep choosing the kind of courage that brings you back to yourself.